So there are many perspectives on what co-teaching is. I stick with Marilyn Friend's version of co-teaching. She's the guru in co-teaching. She coined the term co-teaching. And when I went to one of her conferences, she used the analogy co-teaching is like a marriage, right? So with the slides that you'll see, the PDF that you'll see in this PowerPoint presentation, you will see those visuals and you will see lots of things referring to co-teaching being a marriage. When I was a special ed teacher, I was a co-teacher in the high school setting, and I had a few really negative experiences and many positive experiences. I definitely love co-teaching. I think it's a great structure, but many times we're not able to execute it appropriately in our current budget situations, schedules. So, in my current position, we have done away with co-teaching completely in our district, as we did not feel that it was a good use of our resources and instruction for our students. A few reasons for that. So, when we talk about co-teaching, we need to think about, number one, what is the purpose? So our purpose of co-teaching is to look at having students included in the mainstream setting, right? Our typical peers and our students who have IEP services. With that being said, as we talked about in first class, that's not the only requirement of inclusion. It's purposeful instructions happening in that class. And when I look at it from the administrative lens, if I'm having a special ed teacher teach with a regular teacher, that's 2 adults in a classroom, right? That's a lot of money. And I'm only going to support that happening if I'm actually having individualized instruction and meaningful instruction happening in that classroom to all students by both adults. And the secondary reason is to reduce the student-to-teacher ratio. So far too many times when I walk into a co-taught class, the regular teacher is presenting the material, and the special ed teacher is walking or floating around, or even sometimes sitting in the back of the classroom because that might be the directive the teacher gave. Or the special ed teacher doesn't want to interrupt anything, it doesn't want to be a distraction. That doesn't serve our purpose because that does not reduce the student-to-teacher ratio to give instruction, and that is our ultimate goal in co-teaching. That's why co-teaching was developed. So, with that being said, co-taught classes are only two certified professionals. It is not a paraprofessional and a regular teacher. That's just a supported class. The difference is there should be instruction happening by both people in the room. So, one thing that is very important in order for co-teaching relationships, partnerships, marriages to happen is time. That is one big thing that is not always possible, and that's why co-teaching relationships fail. So co-teaching can't be done on the fly. The 2 adults have to sit down, the 2 teachers have to sit down and plan and review lessons. That can be done virtually, that can be done in person, whatever it may be. The special ed teacher and the regular teacher have to work together to make those lessons accessible to all students and meet those instructional needs of the student. So, that is the number one downfall that I find in public schools today, is there isn't the time to do that planning. When I first started co-teaching, our administration felt strongly about it and would pay us up to 1 hour a week extra planning time after school. We also had common preps with that person. So that made the time available to us to do the work we needed to do. A few other things that were really important that was supported by administration was that both teachers in the rooms were equals and they were responsible for all students in the classroom, which included being responsible for all communication with parents in the classroom, regardless of their if they had a disability or not. So when I walked in the classroom, I should have had my name on the board, even though it wasn't my room, as well as the other teacher's room. So both names were on the board, and if another student walked in the class and said, well, why is Miss Scorboni's name on the classroom? She doesn't teach this room. And the response from the regular teacher should be, oh, we do teach together in a different class, right? No big deal. Same thing in PowerSchool. You could have 2 adults on a PowerSchool report card, on PowerSchool for accessibility as co-teachers, and that way all parents see both teachers are responsible for that class, not just one. Silly things like having space for personal belongings, places to sit. So if I'm in an elementary school classroom, I have an adult-sized chair in that room. If I need to sit down, I have a workspace somewhere that a student could come conference with me, those types of things. And both teachers really have that lead role. So it's really important to think of it, it was explained to me once as improv, right? So if a student asks me a question and my co-teacher doesn't agree, they need to say, yes, yep, that's true. We could consider this, right? So I'm not saying no, I don't agree, but I can flip it, right? I can sort of give another suggestion without undermining the other person. So if I say, yes, you can go to the bathroom, the other teacher shouldn't say, no, it's not a good time. I'm an adult. I made the decision. You can go to the bathroom right now, right? So we need to make sure those lines of communication are clear and both adults are equals in the classroom. And sounds silly, but both teachers should be able to talk during instruction. So I had an experience in my first school where the regular ed co-teacher would not let the special ed teacher move in the classroom, get out of her seat, talk to a student, or say anything during any kind of lecture period time. That is not a co-teaching relationship, okay? And that is a waste of resources because that adult is just sitting there doing nothing to support students for a designated amount of time. And the other thing is both teachers need to work with all students. So again, if our goal of co-teaching is to reduce the student-to-teacher ratio, the special ed teacher should not just be pulling small groups of special ed students to provide instruction. It should be planned, so we're using the co-teaching structures that we'll talk about in a little bit to reduce that student-to-teacher ratio and to have planful groups that can benefit all students. So before we even get to that point, a few things that we really need to consider is, am I ready to commit to a co-teaching relationship? Is that going to be something that I will be successful in? Am I ready for that vulnerability? It's really vulnerable. So I think of it as a marriage as well. Like, I'm going to have difficult conversations. So when I was at the magnet school, the co-teacher that I worked with for math that I've mentioned before, who was super organized, she was apprehensive. She had a really bad experience before co-teaching. So before we started, we sat down and we talked about our prior experiences, what we expect out of a co-teaching relationship, what are things that are pet peeves that bother us, right? So she had very clear pet peeves. I didn't really have things that bothered me too much, but she did. But those were important things to share, so I didn't do those on a daily basis that would annoy her, right? And I have to respect that was her classroom as well. So there were some things that I said, yep, that I can do that. Some things I can't. So one of her, she felt like during assessments it had to be completely quiet. But I felt like that wasn't always appropriate because we may have to go and support a student that's stuck in an assessment, right? Stuck on a question. I may have to clarify. So that was a conversation we had to have, and she understood why that had to happen. And we just talked about what that, conversation level would be like, different strategies to make that an agreeable situation. And you also have to think about, you have someone watching you teach every single day. And so you should give each other feedback on what went well, what didn't go well, ask questions about your instruction. Those are things that are useful in a co-teaching relationship. One of my earlier co-teaching relationships, when I was teaching behavioral students, I brought a pretty heavy load of students into that classroom. That teacher was not prepared for that. He was a first or second year teacher, and when he taught, and everyone was supposed to listen. Well, that was not going to be the case with my students. There was going to be a little drama. So I really had to work with him to understand how to shape behaviors, how to model, how not to get visibly frustrated, how we could set up the classroom to prevent behaviors, how you can be proactive, all of those types of things. He actually went to Dunkin' Donuts our second day of class that evening, and sat down and said to himself, before I leave here, I'm going to decide if I'm going to teach or not any longer, because our class was quite entertaining. Because we had just started, we hadn't established some of those norms. We were going to work towards that. By the end of the year, we had an amazing class. He loved it. He couldn't wait for us to teach again. He couldn't wait for my students to come back that I worked with. And he learned lots of strategies. To the next year, where he knew we had one really difficult student coming in, he said, can I talk to the student before class? You run the lesson. I'm going to go take a walk with the student. Like, those are those relationships that he would have never built before because he hadn't had those strategies modeled. It was a history class. History is not my jam. So as much as he learned behavioral strategies and formatting strategies and assignments and ways to make things accessible to all students, I learned a lot about the content and how to present that content to students in a meaningful way. He had a really great style about him in terms of making history engaging. The reason I don't have history knowledge is because my classes were boring when I took history. I was just taking notes and it was simple memorization. It wasn't interesting to me. So he made them very accessible. to the point where, I was able to teach them the content because it made sense to me how he was teaching it. I would be able to implement strategies, those types of things. One of the most important pieces that made that relationship successful was that we addressed the class as equals. We were always equals. He always asked me my opinion. I asked him his opinion in front of students. I graded all the student work, so they saw me very much as an equal. And I would teach parts of lessons. And many of times it was just introductory pieces or review of homework or things that I was more comfortable with. But the first day of class, he actually reviewed more of the syllabus. Well, actually, we would share going back and forth, reviewing the syllabus, and then I would actually start the first lesson. And then he came in and he talked about the history behind the lesson and the application. So students from day one saw us as equals. I never sat back. He never sat back. We took mixed groups of students. We implemented the co-teaching structures that we'll talk about. So those are the things that we had to really work on and really trust each other, that if I said I was going to do something, it would be done in a timely manner, and vice versa. You have to give up some of your job and give it to the other person, and I had to do the same thing to him. So those were two very important pieces to that relationship being successful. And there were bad days. There were days where we had to address things with each other that weren't comfortable. But if we didn't do that, that would have just lingered on and students wouldn't be successful. Okay, so let's talk about why co-teaching can be a really successful and important strategy in an educational setting. So regular teachers, right, they're great at content, they're great at understanding, rules and regulations and discipline, on understanding what a typical learner looks like, what the standard should be when it's met. And they are masters of pacing, right? They know their pacing guides, they know what the curriculum is. Special ed teachers, on the other hand, are really great at making adaptations to work, making things accessible, modifications, accommodations, helping students organize, communicate, sort of notice when things are off and knowing when to intervene. Having those relationships with students and knowing how to even have relationships with students that they maybe are not interacting with on a daily basis. Paperwork, making sure we're keeping it legal, we're following the plan, we're making sure the instruction is happening. But we're also the land without time sometimes, right? We just want to have them learn it. We want to take the time it takes when everyone else is flying by us. So those two things can together and mesh together appropriately can make a really successful classroom. Okay, so we have sorry, it's been a little while, 6 co-teaching strategies or approaches that we should be implementing. We should not implement every single one every week. We should not even have implemented probably one every month, all of them in 1 month. We want to take 1 or 2 at a time and get really good at them and make sure they apply to the lesson. So we don't want to pick the strategy before we know what the lesson is. We want to look at the lesson and then decide which strategy or approach to co-teaching would be best for our students to access this information. That's the layer that we want to move to, is curriculum first, and then how do we layer the approach on top of it to make the curriculum accessible. And again, lower the student to teacher ratio. That is our number 1 goal. So our first one's 1 teach, 1 observe. This is not what you probably think. This is not that the special ed teacher sits in the back or stands in the back and observes the lesson and then just jumps in. 1 teach, 1 observe is we are observing for a purpose, right? So 1 teacher is teaching something and 1 teacher is observing. And primarily, I guess I would say, don't even think of observing, think of taking data or having a purposeful observation. So I may say, okay, today in this lesson, I want to see how many students are responding, or am I calling out enough students, or am I giving enough opportunities to respond, whatever it may be. So 1 person would be taking that data and 1 person would be teaching part of the lesson. That shouldn't be happening for a 40-minute period. That could be happening for a 15-20-minute part of the lesson. And again, that's purposeful. And that should not be happening every day. But if you guys have, if the co-teaching partnership has a question they want answered, what's going on in the classroom, really what's the frequency of disruption, who's, how many students are on task, are we keeping students engaged, whatever that may be, we can take that data, right? So that's 1 teach, 1 observe. Purposeful, not just, I'm going to observe just to sit back. okay? The next one is station teaching. Station teaching is what I think of in an elementary classroom, right? So it's a really good strategy to lower student-to-teacher ratio, and it's a great way to do pre-teaching, reteaching, and drilling for tests and practice things. So we want to think about multiple stations in the classroom. The stations stay the same. The students rotate throughout the station. I think of as your elementary classroom does this very well all the time. So one station may have a special ed teacher, one station may be an independent station, and one station may have the regular ed teacher. Again, all students will access both teachers in the rotation. Special ed students should not stay with the special ed teacher the entire time. Parallel teaching. So this is it's very close to what station teaching is. So parallel teaching is there's two lessons going on at the same time on the same topic, but there may be different approaches to the end product, right? So, for example, when I had taught a different class that had co-teaching in it a while back, I had these two older gentlemen who were physics teachers, and they were getting their masters simply for a pay raise. Hey, it's a fact of life. So they were in my class, and they had never co-taught because they taught AP Chem and physics, so there was not going to be a special ed teacher in that classroom. So when they taught their lesson, which I thought this concept was fascinating because I had never experienced it, they taught some kind of physics graphing lesson, and they split the class into two groups. One group used more of a paper pencil kind of modeling approach and manipulatives. The other part of the class used a graphing calculator. So again, they came out with the same data at the end. They were able to talk about the data between the two groups at the end and have a class discussion and talk about actually the different ways they came to the same data, right? So same idea or topic of the lesson going on in a parallel setting, but maybe a different approach to what's going on. It doesn't have to be a different approach, but it can be a different approach. It could be the same exact lesson, that's okay, especially in our earlier stages of co-teaching, but two different approaches would be great as well, because then you could split the students based on their needs, based on their learning styles, prior understandings, whatever it may be. Okay, alternate teaching. So alternate teaching is done sort of to help to pull us. I guess I actually equate it to small group, right? A pull-out group. So again, doesn't have to be the special ed teacher, it could be the regular ed teacher, but this would mean there's a full class lesson going on, and at some point strategically, one of the teachers pulls a small group of students out for a purpose for 5, 10, 15 minutes, and then they join the lesson, and they should not have missed anything. They should be able to join back in. So for example, it may be if there were a group of students who were out the day before. Once sort of some of the lessons planned, there's a little review. I may pull a group of students out and give them more of the quick snippet of content that they missed the next day that they're actually reviewing in the whole group, but they'd be lost in the review. So I'm going to catch them up. So then the review's done, my catch-up work is done, so they have the concepts to move into the activity with the whole group. Okay, so very strategic. Maybe I'm pre-teaching. So maybe most of the class right now is doing a warm-up, and I pull a small group and I do some pre-teaching for the lesson that's going to happen, and I want them to make sure that they are ready to go, so they're not actually missing, because it's just a warm-up, and that may be review from the day before, and they don't need to do that. It wouldn't impact the rest of their class, or they won't be missing anything. Again, this is not all the time. This is very strategic, and they should not be missing out on anything that the rest of the class is learning. All right, so one teach, one assist is the one that we use a lot, and it does not reduce student-to-teacher ratio in the most positive way. So one teach, one assist, one teach, one drift, also known as one teach, one float. And what we want to do is think about what is the purpose? Why are we floating? And how are we helping students when we're doing that drifting or floating in the classroom? What is the purpose? So if someone's teaching, why am I floating? What am I doing? Am I behaviorally prompting? Am I providing cue cards? Am I providing task reminders? What am I doing? I should be really actively floating around with a purpose. The other thing that's important to this is the floater or the drifter or the assister, whatever we want to call that person, should not always be the special ed teacher. It should also be the regular ed teacher, and you should be switching roles when using this strategy. That happens very rarely, but that is the purpose of co-teaching, is to switch roles and not always to be the same role. So that special ed teacher should be giving instruction. I know that does not happen in most situations, but that is the purpose of co-teaching. Both teachers do all roles. Teaming. Teaming is sort of what I think of as, improv is the best way to describe it. So, two teachers are at the front of the room, the regular and special teacher are at the front of the room, and they are teaching together. They're bouncing off each other. They both know what the lesson is. So I may be writing this. Then this teacher asks the group a question. I record it. I then ask the group a question. The other student records it. We bounce back and forth in terms of those concepts. Again, this teaming concept many times heads into second semester, year 2, when you're comfortable with the content, comfortable with each other, and know when to step in and not step on each other's toes. I like to use this strategy when teaching, different kinds of concepts where I may notice students are confused, right? So I may ask the stupid question. I may say, well, Mr. So-and-so, could you tell me more about that? Or how could we look at that differently? Or for some reason that didn't make sense to me, right? So I can ask those questions, be part of that conversation, and we can almost tag team and bounce things off each other to actually help our students. It just really shows also a really positive relationship between the two adults that you're modeling for the students. You can model language, you can model pro-social behaviors, all those types of things. So those are your choices for officially co-teaching. Those are the approaches that we have. And on the slides, I actually show what is the ideal percent of time you should be using that approach in the classroom. You will see 1 teach, 1 observe, and 1 teach, 1 observe, and 1 teach, 1 assist or drift are the lowest percentages. You should not be using them as much. Things like parallel teaching and station teaching provide the highest or lowest, student to teacher ratio, and that's the whole purpose of having 2 adults in a classroom. So many of you probably do co-teach. Just keep these things in mind and keep open communication with your co-teacher. Again, these are district initiatives. These are district perspectives on what's appropriate and what's not. Going back to the reason that we don't co-teach, again, is because we do not think that there's, at this point, an advantage to having 2 adults in the classroom, because from the special ed perspective, I'm looking at instruction and goals and objectives. And many times in a classroom, that's a co-taught classroom, that's not happening. This special ed teacher doesn't have those opportunities to give students specialized instruction. It becomes more of the assisting and the prompting and supporting versus the instructional piece that can be done at other times more effectively. So